fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, and we are back here at Varn Blog with Daniel, What is Politics, and we are continuing our series on the necessity of understanding material limits. And we started off with a critique of David Graeber, but we're going to actually go into some of the basics that we hinted at before, into the world of hunter-gathering and game theory and the limits of game theory. I'll talk a little bit about that too. But first, let us begin. I saw you had an interesting debate on the interwebs over the origins of agriculture, and I have known, because I kept up with this. I knew this when I studied anthropology 20 years ago, that the thesis that was maintained in the early 20th century, and then a lot of people still kind of de facto maintain, that agriculture was adopted because after the Holocene, because it was so productive, so very, very productive, that people got shorter, bones got less dense, and disease became rampant. So let's talk about the material conditions here. Why is it that agriculture does not exist before the Holocene, and what are the theories as to why people did adopt it if it led to worse health outcomes in almost every situation?
So people didn't really realize that there were worse health outcomes systematically almost everywhere where you saw agriculture. Not absolutely everywhere, but most places. But we can talk about the exceptions later. But until the late 70s, when Mark Nathan Cohen, put out his book. Oh God, I forget what it's called now. Anyhow, so you couldn't have, and the theory was, well, people were really stupid before 12,000 years ago. And then somehow there's some genius, maybe a white, the first white man or something, decided to, dig into the ground and put seeds in there. Well, that was always seen as suspicious because every hunter-gatherer society that we know about knew agricultural techniques, but they just would explicitly choose not to use them. And then, like you pointed out, in the late 70s, early 80s, it became clear that when people switched to agriculture, the results were always bad. People's nutrition went down, their bones became more porous, they got shorter, their teeth got worse, they had cracks in their bones, women would do worse than men. So you saw evidence of more gender hierarchy. So what we found out, and there's no 100% conclusive theory on this, but it seems pretty clear, and I'm pretty convinced of this. They did in, when was it? In 1999 or 2000, they dug into the ice in Greenland, and then they found this it's like kind of like a tree ring record of the the eons. And basically until 12,000 years ago, when the Holocene suddenly sort of starts very quickly, the Holocene geological era, which is the area of climate, you didn't have enough carbon in the atmosphere to really sustain agriculture very productively. And more importantly, the climate in the Paleolithic era, the Pleistocene geological era, where the Paleolithic era happens, which is when we became a species, was fluctuating so wildly and so rapidly that within 20 years, but within 1 or 2 generations, you'd have massive climate change that we have today only every several hundred years, okay? So if you would start to do some agriculture, it might work. And we found actually some failed experiments with agriculture dating back, I think the earliest one might have been 23,000 years ago, maybe earlier. But they started a little bit and then they give up because the climate is just changing too much. The weather's too unpredictable. It's not a sustainable way. It's something that you can do a little bit extra of on the side, like the way sort of some Australians or other people might do, but it's not something that you can really organize your society around in any way. Until all of a sudden, 11,700 years ago, climate shifts massively. and that becomes an option. So before then, if hunting and gathering became, food became scarce, population became too dense, you had basically two options, which is go to war, fight somebody, or die. But then all of a sudden, 11,700 years ago, you have a third option, agriculture. And that's obviously preferable to dying. So people did that.
Yep, and you generally preferable to going to war. I mean,
generally, usually, yeah.
I mean,
But
yeah, it's actually interesting. I one time pointed out to someone that I actually believe the thesis, for example, that slavery was emerged as a way to maintain complex society, but it also emerged as a way to not eliminate everybody during a war.
oh, interesting. Okay.
This is and I'm talking antique slavery, which is kind of a different thing than what we're talking about right now. Our modern industrial chattel slavery, which is frankly way worse, unless you're like a galley slave, which is not to say that antique slavery was good, but I bring it up because I think people underestimate how many times societies will evolve to minimize war. That warlike societies happen, they occur, particularly in like in nomadic pastoralists, frankly. That's like the number one condition for like encouraging war banding. But
stealing is your best economic activity, really.
Right.
And there's a lot of theory that you can't actually survive just from pastoralism. You know, the old theory used to be that, oh, well, we went from hunter-gatherers to pastoralists because it resembles hunting and gathering in a lot of ways. It's nomadic, it's bands, but probably you can't really live off pastoralism. You need agriculture. So you need farmers that you could steal from to live. So stealing, it's like being a pirate in a way. Stealing is your way of life.
I mean, nomadic pastoralists,
friends
are like basically land pirates. But it's an interesting. I always loved, actually, as a side note, I always loved those early 20th century like stage theories of prehistory, because I'm like, why do we see them coexist now if they're stages?
Well, the implication was because they're dumb. Well, these people never, and that's the sort of implication of that. If you take that theory seriously, you're like, well, these people never evolved because they're dumb. Though some people had, like, you know, Lewis Henry Morgan, you know, he was sort of wrestling with that. He had stage theory, but he really liked the people he was studying and had enormous respect for them. So he didn't want to go there, but you saw him sort of wrestling with that sort of idea.
Why are these smart people doing this dumb thing that shouldn't still exist? Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this gets us to comparison, though. So we have the agricultural societies. We could talk about the variety of agricultural societies, because you know, when we talk about hunter-gatherer societies, there's a bunch. There's also a variety of agricultural societies. And one of the theories I used to, that just occurred to me as a mental game when I was doing anthropology, for example, is, why do agriculture societies occasionally develop warrior classes? And I'm like, let's see how close they are to a plane where there would be nomadic pastoralists.
Wait. I missed what you said. What classes? What kind of classes?
Warrior classes. Because not all people miss. They think this happens in all agricultural societies, but it doesn't.
No.
So I had I just gamed this out. So, you know, when I say game this out, I just played a scenario. I was like, okay, so if I have good agricultural land, but I'm not near a plain, what's the likelihood there are a lot of, say, pastoralists who have to steal my carbohydrates?
Yeah.
Probably not a lot. And so the pressure to use surplus to develop a warrior class is going to be kind of low. Whereas if I'm with a bunch of, you know, particularly horse raiding Asian steppe peoples, the pressure to develop a warrior class, like on the edges of Europe and India, would be kind of high. Now, I actually have seen people this is a thought that has occurred to many anthropologists, but I don't think anyone's systemically proven that that's the thing that does it. But
You mean like a separate warrior class, not just because, like among a lot of American Indians, the entire population, male population, would be the warrior class.
No, a separate warrior class, one
Okay.
where you have to sustain it and actually have a classed society.
Oh yeah, you need a certain amount of surplus. There's a whole bunch of things you need, for that.
Right, like there's like you need birth of surplus, but then you need a reason to develop. Like it doesn't seem like that develops super organically. Like I mean, it develops organically, but it wouldn't develop everywhere organically, right? Because you wouldn't need it, and it's a lot of reason to have a professional army. Like the ancient Greeks didn't have a professional army. Indigenous people in the Americas didn't tend to.
Mm-hmm. Well,
there are some that did, but in general they didn't tend to. Where like, why would you need a highly specialized special army? And I think like, you start dealing with certain kinds of raiding conditions, and you might.
I wonder. I don't know where I'm just talking. I'm just theorizing, but the pastoralist class, the pastoralist tribes, historically would eventually conquer other groups permanently, not just raiding and stealing, but under certain conditions, it's more advantageous to just go and settle there. And a lot of the great empires historically are the result of pastoralist, nomadic pastoralist,
right.
The Arab empires, stuff like that. So some of the warrior classes is just the conquering ethnic group basically installing itself as a warrior elite because they have to keep the population down.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Aryan invasion thesis is that all over Europe and India, like,
yeah, exactly.
And while I think the Aryan invasion thesis, A, it has its racist past, and B, it's overstated, there's some truth to it. I mean, like it's obvious in India where you have like different genetic holotype groups between castes and whatnot. Like it's So let's go back though to the base here.
Let me just write something about because something happened at grad school that was really interesting when we studied Indian charities. But anyways.
Oh, that's interesting. All right. So we have agriculture on one hand, and we know that even though it's more productive than warfare in every instance, including fairly modern ones, people like are surprised when I'm like, agriculture came really late to the British Isles, so we know what it did really clearly. And you just see stunting everywhere once it comes. Now I don't know that we have, I think a lot of there were already pastoralists and cattle raiders and stuff in the Isles, so there's that. So you're not dealing with pure hunter-gatherer societies. Plus,
no, they'd already been placed by that point,
right? But agriculture came late, so our fully developed mass agriculture came late. There was agricultural pockets, but and you see health decline rapidly. Cities are the same way. Like cities require agriculture. Are there non-agricultural cities? I know we have mass buildings, that people will bring up. People make a lot of hay out of that place in Turkey.
Cattle Yahuk Setchet. I never pronounce it.
Right. And then Glipi Tepe too. Those are the two places that come up the most.
Not really. Göbekli Tepe is not a city, but it's just a mass monument made by
right.
Çatalhöyük, which I'm pronouncing completely wrong, is a city. I'm talking outside of my area of knowledge, but there I think are non-agricultural cities, but they're trade cities.
Right.
Right. And I think that my theory for like if Graeber and Rangel are right, and the other people who argue this, that there were these egalitarian or relatively egalitarian cities, I would guess that they probably emerged from some kind of egalitarian-ish society like the Haudenosaunee, for example, that ended up finding themselves at the center as civilizations popped up around them, or other cultures needed trade goods. They found themselves the people who were able to supply those trade goods, and then they were able to densify, their settlement into a city and maintain an egalitarian basis that way. That's like the Indus. I could be totally wrong, but that's my working theory for what egalitarian cities were. Trade city, because you don't have this class of agriculturalists. You don't have these different classes. I'm guessing it would come from something like that, an egalitarian society that found itself at the center of a trading network and that was able to maintain egalitarian relations that way.
All right, so let's talk about what if immediate return hunter-gatherers follow a fairly consistent pattern of pretty high egalitarianism, you know, even on gender things and things that you don't always assume in early works on anthropology and egalitarianism. Why are there a diversity of social relations in hunter-gatherers? Well, you wanted to go into there's two broad classifications and they explain a lot.
Well, there's no great. So Graeber and I are going to talk about this, and they're sort of right. There's a lack of classification in hunter-gatherers that works very well. There's been simple versus complex hunter-gatherers, immediate versus delayed return. These sort of things are helpful, but they don't explain everything. They explain kind of always one thing. And the one thing they always explain is the difference between immediate return hunter-gatherers and everybody else. But you can actually divide things into a bunch of different categories. And the other category that's not been made sort of into a category, I think people are just starting to do that now, is hunter-gatherer fishers. So almost every immediate return society, and there are a couple of exceptions which are interesting to talk about and why that is. Every hyper-egalitarian society is an immediate return society, but not every immediate return society is a hyper-egalitarian society. The Australians are actually immediate return foragers, but they have a gender hierarchy and some gerontocracy. We'll talk about that in a second. But the other category that we see, and we see other categories, but the other more clear category is because at the end of the day, right, the postmodernish people are correct in that every situation is different. It's just not completely different. So the patterns that we see emerging, immediate return, hunter-gatherer fishers. Hunter-gatherer fisher societies tend to be quite hierarchical, warlike, almost the opposite of the immediate return societies. And hunting and gathering is a term that just means people who don't subsist from agriculture. So it's a very big grab bag, category. And people tend to think that everybody running around in a grass skirt is a hunter-gatherer, but that's not it at all. It's everybody who doesn't do agriculture. Lots of people who run around in grass skirts do agriculture. But you can also divide things. There's other categories that I think need to be made, but tethered foragers. There's people who do horticulture part of the year and do foraging the other part of the year. There's all kinds of there's different tethered people like the Inuit who are semi-nomadic. They stay in one place part of the year, and then the other place they're running around. Those you see sort of patterns in those sorts of societies that do similar things. You see similar patterns, but at the same time, every society is different in its way. Yeah. So
let's talk about that though, because I had a theory, and this actually was based on my studies of earlier anthropology, going back to Marcel Mauss and early 20th century anthropology, about surplus. And the one thing we could say about surplus is it's necessary for a class society. So we agree on that.
Yeah.
But I had been speaking as if it was sufficient to explain class society, and you push back on me on that. So why do we have evidence of? I mean, the obvious one is I guess, and I wasn't even thinking about this when is natural abundance and permaculture amongst certain kinds of immediate return hunter-gatherers, stuff like that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways of looking at it. So how do I know, or how do we know that surplus does not equal hierarchy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a mistake that a lot of anthropologists and materialist anthropologists have made over the years. They just
and a lot of primitivist anarchists too.
Those people too, yeah, exactly. But so if we go back even, non-humans, if you look at chimpanzees versus bonobos that we always compare ourselves to because they're our closest relatives, well, the chimpanzees live in a much more resource-sparse environment than bonobos do. Bonobos have a lot of fruit, a lot of food just sitting around that they don't have to work as hard to get. And they're much more egalitarian. They're not egalitarian, but they're much more egalitarian than the chimpanzees are, who have a much more strict hierarchy. And which brings us to the other point, is that people think that the immediate return hunter-gatherers are divined by people who procure food and then eat it in short order after a couple of days without any serious processing and without storing food. So people equate storing food with surplus. But there's actually, as we see in the chimpanzees, the bonobos, they're surplus. It's just they don't need to store it because it's the trees are storing it, and the ground is storing it, and the lake is storing it. Nature is a storage bin. You don't need. What am I going to go take a bunch of apples off the trees or mongongo fruits and then put it in a bin for, when I could just go take them from the tree when I'm hungry? It doesn't. It's not useful to gather surplus, but the surplus is actually sitting around. And the whole original affluent society argument that Marshall Sahlins made was that they're actually kind of resource rich, even people who live in the desert. It's not exactly true. They definitely have some stress, but they do have what I think is functionally storage, just like the bonobos do. They live in a richer resource environment. Now, in my mind, the way you get hierarchy is you have one person or group of people able to control resources that other people depend on to survive. That's criteria number one. But criteria number two is there has to be no better preferable alternative to those resources. So it's preferable for me to subject myself to the abuse or whatever of the dominant person or group than go out on my own. Because if I go out on my own, I'll die, or I'll just be miserable, or I'll be killed by other people, or I'll be killed by the people who are hoarding the resources, because they're my slave masters, whatever it is. So surplus is part of that equation, because with surplus, it helps you build a armed force of some kind. It helps you hoard resources. It's more preferable. A homeless person can go around scrounging around for food in various ways. Homeless people are very much like immediate hunter-gatherers, by the way, and they have a very similar social structure. But I can go around and be homeless, but it's not preferable to me going to get a job, even though that sucks, and the owner has the surplus that he doles out to me. You know what I mean? So he makes it more attractive than the alternative by having that surplus. So the surplus is important because of war and because it's just attractive. I have, get my goodies, just clean my floor, do what I want, right? There are other not criteria, but elements that fulfill those two criteria of hierarchy. And one is surrounding population. Once there's nowhere to go forage, James C. Scott talks about escape crops. Like people were escaping the domination of civilization by adopting certain crops that are easy to pick up and go and plant somewhere else, certain kinds of horticulture. And David and Graeber, the Graeber talk about this a bit in their book, but they get it backwards. They think that people choose freedom because they have the idea of choosing freedom, but no, freedom is a fact on the ground. If these escape crops are available, people will tend to choose them because it's more preferable than being subject to abuse. So once we see, for example, the hunter-gatherer fishers, they talk about in Graeber and Wengro, but people study this. The Pacific Northwest Coast Indians, for example, were very hierarchical by hunter-gatherer standards. They had social classes. They had a chief, they had a nobility class, they had a commoner class, and they had a slave class, right? And your class determines how you get access to resources, who gets doled out, like at the potlatch festivals, who gets the most goodies. And they're actually based on a bunch of things, but in part is who got the best fishing territory back in the day when people started colonizing these fishing areas, right? So the chiefly lineage tends to be the one that managed to get the best fishing spot and defend it. That's how they became the wealthiest. That's how they could dole out surplus to others. And that's what legitimizes their existence is, well, I'm giving you stuff, so tolerate me. I'm sort of mangling it. But their hierarchical social structure took 800 years to manifest itself. They still had territoriality, they still had surplus, they still had all that stuff. But the difference is that probably, and this is not 100% proven, the surrounding areas, it was easier to escape and go do something else for a while. So the people with the best fishing territories couldn't really impose their authority on anybody. But eventually, over time, other people start populating the other areas more densely. And if you go out, well, you're just going to get killed or you're going to starve. So then the hierarchy manifests itself more and more over time. And that's the same reason why you have agricultural societies that were egalitarian for a long time, but then eventually become hierarchical. It's because there's nowhere else to go. And when there is somewhere else to go, the leaders can't impose. It's like a labor market, right? I'm at a job. There's a labor shortage. There's 20 places I can go, right? So every boss has to kiss my ass, and if I show up late, they can yell at me, but they can't really do anything because they need me more than I need them, or equivalent to I need them. But once there's no other place to go because all the other positions have been filled, and there's 10 people looking for every job, well, now the conditions are squeezed, and the hierarchy is much more strict. That's got to look at it the same way.
It's funny to me that people can see this kind of crude economic determinism in modern people. I mean, even Graeber and Wingrove do, but somehow not see it in non-urban, non-highly technological societies. I guess because lower numbers of inputs leads you to think that there's more choice.
I think people think it's racist. Like the same person who will say, oh, the Democrats or the Republicans are doing this because they're getting money from corporate donors, they can't apply that same humanity to hunter-gatherers because we're saying that the material conditions determine their culture. That's a bit insulting, and in a way, it is a bit insulting to everyone's culture. It takes away our agency. We don't like that, We like to think that, well, I have these values because I have these values, and these values are great, and they come from God or they come from within, and they're so important.
But it tends to lead to cultural determinism, which is also kind of racist. Like the idea that the culture that I come from sets all these determinate notions for me, and I don't have any agency from that. But they can't explain where the fuck it comes from.
Exactly.
It's
super racist, because if you say Saudi Arabia, and Graeber and Winogrove sort of do this inadvertently, but if you say Saudi Arabia, the reason they're so patriarchal and male dominated, and you don't have a material analysis of it, well, it's because they're just a bunch of assholes, right? And then, in Sweden, they're just such great people because they're so egalitarian. Oh, the Mbudi are just great people because they have gender egalitarianism, and the Leze, their neighbors, are just bad people. That tends towards racism. When you have a materialist attitude, you have a bit there, but for the grace of God go I analysis of the world. If I was in their shoes, I'd have the same, not just if I was in their shoes, I was raised by the same parents, but if I was in the same conditions, my grandchildren would have the same values as those people, even if I install in them my own egalitarian values.
Well, this is one of the big things I pull from Marxism that Marxists even don't always pull from. And that's we have the ability, because we have reflective agency, to alter our environment, and frankly, we have always had that, and thus affect our relations of production and relations of everything, like relations of production, maybe even too reductive. Thus, we have a feedback loop mechanism where we can actually change things. Other animals do too, by the way. I mean, not even highly complicated animals. Like we can talk about termites, but
beavers,
beavers, and these animals could cause ecological crises, by the way, too. It's not unique to us.
That's right.
But
I think people in different conditions have less and more ability to actually change their conditions. I think it'd be very hard in certain conditions to change the way things are.
Right. Well, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about some of your points, because I think one thing I got from people who listen to our last interview is they're like, well, is Daniel a primitivist? I'm like, no, listen to his video. He's not.
Yeah.
That's funny. Well, but most people encounter these arguments that we're talking about. The only people who really mention them, other than like you, me, and Arnold Schroeder, are primitivist. I mean, for the most part, and they kind of misuse them, but
they're very immediate return hunter-gatherers. Well, there's the radical anthropology group, which thinks a lot like I do. They're not primitivists at all. So why am I not a primitivist? Well, basically because you'd have to kill off 90% of the world to more than that, more like 99% of the world to live in a hunter-gatherer egalitarian immediate return society.
Yep.
But more importantly, is that because of all the technology, and as it relates to surplus that we were just talking about, we have, I believe, the conditions that can allow for an egalitarian society again, maybe for the first time since we were hunter-gatherers. I mean, some of us still are, but
All right.
that's because we have this surplus. There is enough to go around, which I don't think was the case. Enough to go around comfortably, which I don't think was the case before. And when there's not enough to go around comfortably, people fight and make excuses why they deserve more. If you've been in a relationship, if you've been married, you have any, when you have hard times, people get on each other's nerves because you don't have enough, even if it's not enough resources. I don't have enough space. Oh, my significant other or my roommate is always in my house. You start to get mad at them and invent excuses why it's their fault. You see this in landlord-tenant relationships all the time. You have a landlord and tenant who have a nice relationship. All of a sudden, the market gets really hot, and there's rent control where I am. So I'm actually a lawyer for tenants, by the way. I don't know if you knew that, but so the market gets really hot. There's rent control. All of a sudden, the landlord is just like, "Oh, you're bringing boys home every night." Like to a female tenant, "You're a slut." Like they just start finding stuff to hate about the other person. The material conditions determine the relationship so clearly. Like you just see it. I think from doing this work, I really, materialism became much more clear in my mind than it had before. From 20 years of reading anthropology, I've always had that sort of bent, but it really crystallized, I think, after doing law, which I've only been doing for 5 or 6 years. Yeah.
Right. So what one of the things I find thinking about that, because for me it was as a teacher I started seeing this stuff, and then I started trying to puzzle through what I learned in anthropology with what I learned from sociology with what I learned from economics, and I was like, all of these fields seem to be missing something the way they're generally explained to me, and they're not really separate fields at all. Although economists and sociologists tend to hate each other and like talk about things completely differently, even when they're both leftists. But I was thinking of that because I started thinking about, well, Marxists are materialists, although as a side note, the way they talk about materialism tends to be in idealist typologies, which is maddening.
Can you give me an example?
I mean, the 4 stages that they think everything goes through, like primitive communism, Asiatic despotism, which we never define.
Right.
And these stages are also just purely picked up from early Whiggish liberal stuff. Like that's its origins.
Oh yeah.
And Marx criticizes them, and they're only mentioned actually Marx and Engels like twice. But like Soviet, for example, Soviet historical materialism is based totally off this. So I go back to like, okay, but what are the principles of Marx's and Engels? Like we can throw away like even most of the stuff they did, frankly.
Yeah.
And I'm not.
What were they getting at? Yeah.
What were they getting at? What did they? I always talk about like. I bring this up all the time, and I brought it up even with you, the wolf studies and like Marx's own example, which is about like, we can't know a dog's nature unless we see a dog and dog species being. So we know what dog being's like. Well, it's always moderated by something.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's no pure being because we're always, and even the baboons, like we talked about last time, are affected by their environments.
Right.
Social structure is different in captivity than in the wild, and in different wild conditions, you have different variations.
Variations too. So it's impossible to fully articulate, like when people are like, well, do you believe in human nature? I'm like, yeah, I actually do, but it's so fucking different depending on what conditions it's operating under as to what's going to come out.
There's a range of limits of what we can, we can have some hierarchy. I don't think obviously we have the aptitude for it. I don't think it works that well. I think it causes stress and it needs a lot of energy and force to sort of maintain, but we have the aptitude for it. We definitely have the aptitude for egalitarianism, but that actually causes some strain as well. Talking about game theory, if you look at immediate return hunter-gatherers, because, in the 70s when they started really focusing on them, there was the idea that like, oh, they're just great people. They're Smurfs, they just are good inside their hearts and they love equality and stuff like that. But very quickly, people who studied them are like, they're not any better than anybody else. And when they did game theory studies later, they're like, wow, the most hyper-egalitarian societies are actually a bit more selfish in some of those, which is the dictator game, when you get to determine how much you share with the other person. When it's anonymous, they were actually more selfish than like Americans were. When it wasn't anonymous, they were totally perfectly egalitarian. Oh, that they know who I am. I'm giving 50% to you, 50% to me. Oh, there's 3 people. I'm giving 33, 33, 33. But if it's anonymous, they were keeping more, because equality, as desirable as it is in many ways, is also a bit of a strain. You know, it's also a bit different. If you have kids, you see that enforcing equality gets stressful. You know, it takes them a bit of work, and I think hierarchy takes more work and is less well adapted. You know, if our atmosphere turned into nitrogen, we'd all die. There's limits to what we're made for and what environments we thrive in. But we do have a nature, but it is a definitely fluid nature. It's what makes humans, our nature tends to be more adaptable than other species. We're definitely a jack of all trades species. And that has a lot to do with, I believe, the Paleolithic climate that was fluctuating back and forth. You'd have to change one year, you know, one generation you'd be doing fishing, another generation, the shore, you know, line would swallow up and the fish would be gone, and you'd have to go hunt mammoths or whatever it is. Like anyways.
Yeah.
Tangents.
And so, you know, it's one of those things. I also remember when I used to argue with primitivists about like evolution, and I'd be like, well, we outsourced a lot of our needs for, you know, for natural selection a long time ago. So like, you know, that's what technology does. And we're not the only animal that does it. That's
genetic drift becomes a much more important force among modern human beings, because the forces that would weed people out, aside from plagues and things like that, are very, very mitigated by technology. Absolutely.
Right. And so, but you know, I will say this, and the Arnold's made a whole, you know, like 8-part podcast series on this. Marxists who talk about being materialism tend to be scared as shit of genetic studies, in so much so that they'll even try to reinvent shit like Lacincoism to avoid having to deal with the complications of genetics. Now, I admit, now we know more and more and more about gene expression, genetic noise, epigenetic expression, environmental triggers, that, oh yeah, like that simple Dawkins story even that you got is not remotely gonna explain much for you.
Yeah.
You don't, but it also means to me, like, you don't have to be as scared of it. You're not like a hyper-reductive social biologist from the 60s.
Yeah.
By admitting that genetic drift, populations, and you know,
and we have innate, and that people are different. One person might have more aptitude than another person. People have different tastes. People have different tendencies. It's so obvious, especially if you have kids or have been around kids. There's no way that there's not a lot of us isn't predetermined. But the problem is, and this is from growing up in a hierarchical society like capitalism, but it could be any, we associate traits with good and bad. Okay, there's some traits that are antisocial, you know, a psychopath, dark triad. I don't know how you could spin that as not bad, but in general.
Yeah, but it actually in capitalism, they tend to do well.
They're floating at the top of every, oh my God, I have so many stories about people working in these companies and the, yeah.
Like I was about to say, like, dark triad stuff, we used to have better checks against them in more egalitarian societies.
Absolutely. They're the people who get killed off and now they thrive. Like I bet if you did studies, you'd find that the incidence of the psychopath in a hunter-gatherer society would be like very, very low, and then extremely high, you know, in the corporate.
Right. I'd be like, well, yeah, because the psychopaths who wouldn't die off from ostracization, if not outright murder, would be the kinds of psychopaths who could fit in and like
the ones who know how to at least share and do what they're expected to do. Exactly. And use their psychopathy for other.
Yeah, they might be useful. I mean, they might be useful surgeons. If you get right. Or it might be useful in war or whatever, but like, yeah. But that point though, I think we need to get back to when we talk about these early societies, we're not talking about necessarily that we have to live under those conditions. Because I will say, I was listening to Joel Wainwright give a book talk actually last night. Joel Wainwright, the writer of Climate Leviathan, and he was talking about looking at like indigenous societies in Belize. And like he was like, well, we can we don't have to, you know, he was saying we don't have to base all of our models off the early 20th century, because he was talking about like climate Mao and climate Leviathan and the predominance of Keynesianism and this, you know, and like technocratic capitalism and the other. But then he was like, there are plenty of societies that we don't have to give up our technology for and go live as, that we can see relations, you know, and I sometimes even call them social technologies that we could actually use in modern society to get some of these diffuse structures that are still that could potentially be global, because that's his point, is like anything that we have to do to deal with climate is going to have to be global. But how do you do it without like positing one world leader? And are you even likely to get that? Is that even possible? Like, so how do you have diffuse feedback? And he actually starts looking at because he did a lot of work with the indigenous people in Belize. He started looking at their societies, like, well, what can we extrapolate from that? And that's why this talk about materialism and early political anthropology is so important, because we're extrapolating principles for how we could do things. I will say, like, from my readings of Joseph Tainter and stuff, that a hyper complex society actually encourages overinvestment and high hierarchical single figure individuals, because it seems simple. It seems like it seems like a simple way to outsource over complexity. But Tainter indicates that that like in almost every instance, this is a sign that your society is about to collapse. I would
dispute that, and I would say that we tend towards like high hierarchy, not because of efficiency. Like, you know, you're thinking of like Lenin or something, who's just like, oh, we need to get our economy going. Let's implement this, you know, the Taylor system, for example. Yeah, the industries might work better that way, but hierarchy is really about some people being able to impose dominance on other people. And in our highly technological and high surplus societies, there are a lot of opportunities for some people of extreme inequality, which allows some people to dominate others. If power were distributed more equally, people wouldn't voluntarily organize into dominance hierarchy. They might organize into hierarchy, but it would be a cooperative type of hierarchy, elected leaders and such. I'm always just make sure you don't confuse hierarchy with democratic hierarchy or practical hierarchy with a dominance hierarchy.
Right. Well, let's talk about this, because you talk about it a lot on your channel. What's the difference between a democratic hierarchy, a dominance hierarchy, and then let's talk about a democratic hierarchy versus what we call democracy now.
Okay, right. So at the end of the day, a democratic hierarchy, or you can call it conventional hierarchy, as in a convention, like an agreement or a practical hierarchy, it's a spectrum on the way to dominance hierarchy. It's still a hierarchy, but there's, you know, it's the line. It's like pornography. I know it when I see it, but the line is when, you know, it's like the difference between BDSM and sexual assault, right? When somebody says stop, it could look like the exact same thing, right? But as soon as somebody says stop or says the safe word, if you don't stop, you've crossed the line. Even if it started as one, it could turn into the other. You know what I mean? And that's the law. The law works that way too. If you're playing a game and somebody says the safe word and you don't, well, you're not playing a game anymore. It's sexual assault. So you're going from, you know, democratic hierarchy to dominance hierarchy. Democratic hierarchy is, the way I define it or think of it, is, you know, for example, you can't make a film without a hierarchy. I can't imagine. I would love to see that. It would be hilarious. I think it would be a complete catastrophe. I wonder if anyone's tried. You can't have every single person just making different decisions and arguing about, no, the actor says, no, I don't want to say that line. I want to say this line. You know, it'd make a complete mess. So if we want to make a film, we have to have a hierarchy. There's going to have to be a director. But the difference is the director exploiting everyone? And can anyone leave if they want to? And do we get to choose the director, or does he choose us? You know, basically, and you see this in certain indigenous societies where you have a chief of some sort, but the chief can be disposed of at any point when he no longer serves his purpose. The authority is there to serve the interests of the followers, and not the other way around. Once you're getting into dominance hierarchy, well, the followers are being exploited by the authority figure, and that's really where the difference is. And you can't get rid of them, you know. And so if we talk about a democracy, you know, representative democracy, it's definitely very much on this in the dominance hierarchy, camp,
Yeah, because you can't get rid of them.
It's not the same. Yeah, but you can sort of get rid of them, but
at a certain time in certain countries in certain ways. But yes. But like,
it's
immediate recall is really hard.
Yeah, and it's categorically different from a dictatorship. People don't always realize, because it feels like a dictatorship when you live in a society where you just vote, or maybe you don't even vote and you're not even doing anything. But when the government at least has that kind of fear of getting kicked out of their individual seats, they behave very differently than a government who has no fear of ever being removed from their seats. So as shitty as representative democracy is, it's a category, it's different, but it's on that spectrum, but it's way more in the dominance hierarchy side of the spectrum, because you're literally not making any decisions. And in the workplace, your only decision is I can leave, right? Like, and if the owner has no use for you, well, you can go die. Like, you are there to serve the owner. That's what capitalism is. It's not, the owner's not there to serve you. You are there to serve the owner.
Right.
Yeah, and you had like the Nambikwara. Anyways, there's a bunch of societies where you see that, but they can leverage, in the right circumstances, the elected leader. And you see this happen in cooperatives a lot, all that Michael Albert stuff, he talks about in Argentina, the co-ops formed, but then you have those people who have specialized technical positions, accountants and those kind of people. They end up leveraging their elected positions to dominate and exploit the other people in the industry. So you have to have checks and safeguards and stuff like that. And the thing, what you're talking about, that author that you just mentioned, studying indigenous societies teaches us so much about how we can reorganize our societies. Not that we're going to copy their economies, but we look at the conditions that generate the structures that they have, and we can see, is there anything that we can learn from that? So what I was upset about the Graeber and Wengrow for is that Graeber ignored hyper-egalitarian societies his entire career. He never ever mentioned them until very recently. And then finally, in this book, they finally talk about them and they discuss them a little bit at length, at least. And they don't learn any lessons from them. If you study those societies, and this is what the radical anthropology group is all about, you see that, what are the conditions? And every author that really writes about them tends to focus, whether they are materialists on purpose or not, what are the conditions that create this equality? How does this equality maintain itself? Especially since you see that people are actually kind of selfish when they can get away with it. So it's not just good values, there's something else. If you look at it, you could see that in our society, like I was talking about before, we have a lot of the conditions that might, if we apply ourselves in the right ways, if we organize the technologies that we have, we can recreate a lot of those conditions and live in similar types of societies. And that's a lesson that's lost in that book, which was very upsetting. But it's something that we should be doing without anarcho-privilegizing ourselves into genocide.
Yeah, so it's genocide and probable extinction, because the people who most likely survive anyway are like the awful capitalists who would restart everything and do it all again, and then we die.
Or just eat each other alive. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, there's so much there that, we don't have a lot of time today, and you're probably going to be a regular guest for a while, because this is a big part of what I do, and I'm going to try to also get a planetary between you, me, and Arnold together. Yeah. I'll start a chain on that soon, so audience, you can look forward to that, because we're the people really pushing this right now.
I think we all have a very practical bent towards what we're doing. Like, we're doing these projects not just to get a bunch of followers and get a bunch of, I don't know, a living, which is, I don't think I'm going to.
I still have my day job as a teacher. You're still a tenants lawyer.
I'm working. Yeah.
Arnold does whatever Arnold does. So
the idea is to somehow achieve things, move people towards. I'm trying to build people towards being effective political actors, and my show is going to sort of go more and more in that direction. First, we have to learn the alphabet, then we have to learn how things work, and then we're going to, learn more specific techniques for social change type stuff.
So here's one of the things that people are always shocked by. Actually, to talk about practical stuff for a minute, about anthropology, is, and this is from my teaching life, the number one, if you look at Hatties effects ratios, which is all meta-analysis stuff, and it's even something you could throw at any administrator on earth probably if they know about it and they'll listen to you, because it's solid. There's only like 3 things that actually really affect instruction, and the biggest one is the social or parasocial relationship with the teacher. Not that the teacher is, it's number one. Not
how do I spell it? Hatties?
Hatties effect ratios, I think.
I don't know this.
It's something that like teachers talk about a lot.
Yeah, okay.
Ratios in education. It's John Hattie, Hattie, collected teacher efficacy ratios, which is just it's a ongoing, forever established meta-analysis. And the three things that really matter the most are actually the three things that are the most de-emphasized in modern pedagogy, which is funny.
Doesn't surprise.
Teacher relationships.
Yeah.
The teacher actually knows what they're talking about, which believe it or not, people like Bill Gates 10, 15 years ago were pushing didn't matter.
Yes.
Right. And then is the learning environment provided by the teacher stable? Everything else, there are other things that you can do that have some effect, but all of it's very low. And then everything else that has major effects is actually like social, economic, and outside of the school's control. So, but I say that because these things are about relationships. This is one of the reasons why I don't tell people, I think protesting is stupid. People are like, what do you mean? I'm like, all right, I don't mean to get all like history on you, but old protests was a threat to field an army. That's what it was. That's what you were doing. You were protesting and saying, I have all these people. They're really pissed off. We have sticks and guns. Sticks and arrows. We're not using those sticks and arrows. We're asking you nicely, but we have the sticks and arrows.
Yeah.
But now modern warfare has changed that symmetry, but we still do it as habit. All right. And yes, it's still effectively proving, hey, we can riot.
Yeah. I think it has. I do think it has some force.
Right. And then it might have force. It might have solidarity force. But like, absolutely. But I always say you have to weigh the cost benefit analysis. So, for example, like if you're forever protesting in, say, Portland, and there's right wing actors, and occasionally they're now shooting you, but you're protesting so much, no one even pays attention to you anymore.
Right.
that like the cost benefit analysis, the protest puts it into the stupid category.
Yes. I see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's an opportunity cost. You're wasting time doing stuff.
You're wasting time doing stuff that, and now and now it's increasingly a danger.
And you can get legally over and stuff like that now too. Yeah.
Yeah. So what are you gonna do? But here's where I think protesting is useful: is it does socialize you towards certain things, builds relationships and solidarity. This is also, I hate to say it, why some reform advocacy isn't even bad or stupid.
No, I think
particularly if you're going to go out and meet people who aren't like you. The problem that I've tended to have about how it's done in America is it focuses even if it's working class people, like people like, well, the DSA and the DSA advocacy is all PMC. Actually, no, it isn't. But it's all a specific people in a specific area. So even the working class people that you talk to are tied into this. They are actually still benefiting from the same economic policies that may benefit the people that you're calling the PMC. So you have to be much broader in your organizing and really go out to places where you would not socially fit in. And you have to deal with the fact the people's ideas often don't explain very much. Arnold goes into this all the time. That you go to like he was talking about, he likes to talk about the high grounds of California where there's both the like hippie and hyper right-wing pot growers.
Right.
They effectively act the same.
Yeah.
but there's 1,000 epistemologies for why they do that in that area.
Right.
Like the social consensus for why that's going on doesn't exist. But what you realize, it doesn't have to. Like mountain ranges indicate certain kinds of arrangements. You have certain removal from society. You're going to do a certain limit of things. Your personality may dictate whether you frame it in a left or right wing way, but in effect, it's not going to be that different in what you're actually doing. And I think that realization is something that a lot of people don't have. And I will say climate activists in specific, because they have to go and deal with rural and exurban and suburban populations, run into this more if they actually do the climate activism and not just raising for the Sierra Club.
Yeah.
right? Like,
Right.
and this is where this anthropology stuff really matters. So you can start predicting what the kinds of groups are going to be like in what area, how you're going to need to appeal to them, because a person's temperament is not going to be what actually sets their larger politics. It'll be how they explain
how they
larger
express
politics.
it and what kind of messages they're receptive to. Right. But they're not going to, exactly. Their policies, the things that they prefer are going to be things that they're in their self-interest or perceived self-interest. And that's going to be similar, no matter what your proclivities are.
And this is why I kind of get really pissed off at leftists always talking about collective good. I'm like, that doesn't work on most people. Like most of us are not we are, most of us are selfish, but we're not also not.
Right.
We we're not just selfish. Like most people value their relations, even in a selfish way. They understand that relatively egalitarian relations and reciprocation is actually good for them.
And they're also pleasurable. Like we're hardwired to enjoy generosity and exchange with strangers. You go to a gas station, oh shit, I forgot my wallet. Hey friend, here's $5. Like that stuff happens. There's no reason, like we're wired for that. We wouldn't have survived without that, right?
And that stuff happens regardless of whether or not you're in conservative or liberal. In fact, if there's any indication, it happens more in conservative.
Yeah, well, because it's in rural district, people have a bit more of that, than in
right,
cities.
because they're not as capitalistically alienated. And when I point that out to people, I'm like, our explanations of rural and conservative values are a gloss, and they're not a particularly explanatory gloss a lot of the time. They may be explanatory for policy and large-scale economic change, kinda. But
a lot of the right-wing politics I've noticed in the US has to do, and here in Canada too, has just a lot to do with there's no socializing, not just internet, but human socializing is such an important force in your politics. It determines, in the old, you had your bowling club, your Kiwanis club, whatever, Fred Flintstone with the hat, your different associations and organizations. Those things shape people's politics in conjunction with others. And in the rural areas and suburban areas, the only social activities or places you have are the megachurch and the NRA club. And I know a lot of, I have cousins and relatives, they join the NRA club because it's a wonderful, pleasurable activity. It's one of the only places you're going to go where you're going to meet people and socially exchange with people. And because it's completely, owned by the gun industry, they take advantage of that to propagandize them. And that's the left has to do socializing. It's such a huge force, and people are thirsting for it. They want that, and the same person who's an NRA freak can turn around and be a healthcare for all socialist freak too, if there's some social activity that includes them.
Even the DSA people, in America will talk this way. Like they do see the studies, for example, that reformist semi-socialist policies are actually as popular, even maybe more popular in states like Florida than they are in states like California. Mm-hmm. I also think you can explain it economically. California is more economically polarized than Florida, where Florida is a lot more lower middle class in general. But there is also the sense that, despite all the fact that like the Democrat, we saw this actually in elections in the United States on referenda, on a lot of referenda that for minimum wage, rehabilitation of felons, that stuff did just as well in red states as in California, New York. And in fact, actually,
minimum wage,
they did better on referenda in
Florida,
in Florida than it did in California, for stuff like. And that's actually perfectly logical if you actually look at who would vote and what the wealth distributions are. And then, as I came up with my theory about this in response to Arnold looking at the anthropology, and I'm like, well, okay, if we know that there's the extremophile in politics and that they are conservative or liberal and it's based off of your openness and your experience, but that can't explain these regional distributions. What does? And I was like, 80% of the population is just going with what the leaders in the area are going to do. And there are going to be material and economic inputs that decide what of those two traits openness or closed off to experience are going to be dominant in leadership, and everyone else is just going to kind of follow along because it's in their interest for relations to just kind of follow along.
Absolutely.
And also it's in their material interest economically. So like,
I think social relationships is a need almost as much as food. You know, you get brain damage. People in prison isolation get brain damage after a while. So socializing is a need. That's how cults, you know, people were telling me like, oh, well, your theory is wrong about dominating resource. Why do cults have hierarchy? Well, because cults give you access to a social network, right?
They give you extreme access to a social network.
Yeah,
and but you know, the hierarchical setup of it also that the ability to cut someone off for that gives that the leader a shit ton of power.
And then they eventually actually take your bank accounts and stuff like that too, so they have real power over you. But the social resources are real resources. We need them, you know.
Right. So we still didn't get. I'm gonna have to wrap this up because I gotta go teach. But we still didn't get to the game theory stuff. We got a lot of stuff we're gonna get to.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna. Is 2 weeks good for you?
Sure. Usually, I mean, you gotta let me.
I know. You know, with your schedule.
My schedule's
whatever. Yeah. I will tentatively pitch you in for 2 weeks and I'll check back in. But we'll do maybe a 3 and 4, and then I'll try to get that plenary up with Arnold for all three of us to talk.
Yeah, because I'm gonna talk to on Sunday. We're doing a thing, but then
awesome. And have you, my listeners, if you don't listen to this podcast, you should. But the other one I would tell people to listen to is General Intellect Unit, because I do think if you take the cybernetic stuff and then start, this is what Joel Wainwright was getting me to think about. If you take the technology and system studies and add the anthropology to it, we might actually be able to build a viable materialism on which to build socialist kinds of relations that are global. Otherwise, we're in this fucking nightmare world that we're currently in. Like,
the hope is in those cybernetic type of all that stuff, which I don't understand all that well, but that's really exciting. And I do listen to General Intellect Unit. They covered a lot of interesting stuff there. The Red Plenty, the Norbert Wiener, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that you can use information feedbacks to regenerate egalitarian society by getting rid of opportunity hoarding is such a big fucking deal that people just don't get.
And that's a material condition that makes equality possible. That was, if you ever read Scheidel's The Great Leveler, you ever read that book?
Yes, I read it like last year actually, because I was like, oh, we're gonna be in a time period like that, maybe.
Well, we are headed there, but he's totally pessimistic. But there's actually grains of hopes in that book which he doesn't see. So the theory of the book is that once hierarchy starts, inequality starts establishing itself, it's like gravity. It's like a black hole. It just attracts more and more, and it just gets worse and worse until there's a social collapse, which generates equality, but only equality of absolute destitution. And then it starts all over again. And we're in this period where we had this really, really unusual thing in the post-war period where we had a leveling and thing. But what he doesn't realize, and he sort of touched it, but conditions have changed so much in the last few hundred years. We had representative democracies for the first time, which had never existed before. We had those socialist revolutions, which were horrid in so many ways, but which were something new that didn't exist before. And that post-war leveling is something that had never happened in the world before in that level. Or anyways, very, very rare. And now we with all this stuff, we might be in position to do a real, return to egalitarianism that has never been seen since immediate return hunting and gathering.
All right. Well, we'll talk more about anthropology. I'm going to talk about game theory. I'm going to send you something on Nash equilibrium before we talk next, because I love game theory, but I'm really suspicious of Nash equilibrium, and we can talk about why. All right. Thank you so much for coming on, Daniel, and we'll be back into. Have a great day, man.
Yeah.